Good afternoon. Try now. Hey, much louder. Now I can use my radio voice. Good afternoon. Welcome to the SmallSat working group. Today's session, we have a distinguished panel of SmallSat practitioners, experts, and aficionados. I found myself in the latter category. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our moderator A for today. We have a moderator B that moderator A will actually introduce. Rob Zitz is the Leidos Senior Vice President and Strategic Account Executive for Intelligence and Homeland Security. He's a career intelligence officer, and he was the first Deputy Undersecretary appointed in DHS, where he guided DHS cybersecurity, infrastructure protection, and national communications, state and local grants, exercises and assessments, fire administration, ReadyGov, and the efforts of the Chief Medical Officer. Now, I'm not sure if that's actually a title, but it looked pretty good. Mr. Zitz also served as the first Deputy Associate Director of the United States Secret Service. In that role, he guided transformation efforts needed to modernize the elite law enforcement agency. During his 32-year intelligence community career, Rob rose to the rank of SES 6 and held very significant positions in Army Intel, CIA, NGA, NSA, and NRO. He directed many of the intelligence community's trade studies, which led to funding of major programs in operation today. He led R&D efforts in NGA and NRO, including making the decision to invest in that tiny little company you might have heard of called Keyhole, which later became Google Earth. Rob is widely acknowledged for his groundbreaking efforts to integrate disparate intelligence disciplines and what is commonly known as multi-int today. Rob, and I can say this because I've worked with him on a number of different fronts from the time he was working with Pete Stan to today. He's a visionary leader who can really make a thought process and a vision turn into reality. So without further ado, Rob.
Thanks a lot. My kids say that when the introduction is longer than your presentation, it's time to retire. What we're going to do today is, this is really meant to be a dialogue, but to set the stage, we're going to have each of these speakers give you just a few salient points about what they're doing and where they're headed. And we'll keep them on time, actually, by, I wanted to let you know, if you hear this sound, that says we're at the 2-minute mark, and we're going to move through this, because the idea of our GEOINT Foreword is for you all to be talking to us, to each other, and for us to talk to each other about where we are with this particular topic. Now, I do have the pleasure of doing some introductions here first. I want to start out first by acknowledging my co-moderator. I think really don't need an introduction, but I'll give you one anyway, Jeff Skunk Baxter. Many of you probably aware that Jeff is most famously known for his time with Steely Dan, Doobie Brothers, but as others in the bands were reading, let's just say, some not suitable for work magazines, he was reading Aviation Week and Space Technology. And so over the years, it became known to the Congress that he was actually a subject matter expert, self-taught, particularly in missile defense. In the 90s, he was brought in to work on some committees regarding missile defense, was cleared, brought into the intelligence community. We first met in the late 90s, where he began supporting, at that time, NEMA, then NGA. He's a key consultant and supports, from the DNI on down, virtually all of the intelligence community and a few of the big industry players. He's an expert not only in missile defense and in intelligence systems, but also in the use of data. So when you think about analysts and how analysts of the future will operate, that's what Jeff's about. He's been a key thought leader on SmallSats as well. So as our co-moderator, his deal will be, after we've heard from these panelists, he's going to be a stimulant discussant to get to the audience and the panelists and myself talking about the issue of the moment. Sitting next to Skunk, to his left, is Miglarese. Anne has been actively engaged in the remote sensing and GIS sciences for 28 years. She's worked in state and federal government as well as private sector engineering, management consulting, remote sensing, and GIS companies. She's currently the president and CEO of PlanetIQ, a Maryland-based atmospherics data sales company, which will operate a constellation of 12 small satellites in low Earth orbit. Previously, Ann was principal director with Booz Allen, managing geospatial service offerings across defense, intelligence, and civilian accounts, and was, prior to that, president and CEO of Earth Data International. To Ann's left is Robbie Schingler, co-founder and president of Planet Labs. Robbie is responsible for Planet Labs business and product development, investor relations, and financial and organizational operations. Prior to Planet Labs, Robbie spent 9 years at NASA. He served as capture manager for the Transiting Exoplanet Survey Satellite, or TESS, and helped to formulate the small satellite office at NASA Ames. He had 2 tours at NASA headquarters, served as NASA's open government representative to the White House, and the White House recognized NASA as a model for openness in government based on his work and his team's work. He also served as on the founding team as the chief of staff of the Office of the Chief Technologist at NASA, where he incubated a $650 million space technology program focusing on advanced technology. To his left is Andy Quintero. He's the principal engineer of the Intellectual Property Programs segment of Aerospace Corporation, which includes technology transfer, patent licensing, and over half dozen startups in the last decade he's been involved in. Andy's experience and exposure to people-class satellites goes back over a decade while helping to build the industrial base for small satellites, including those developing and flown by Aerospace. Andy was also chairman of an international small satellite consortia for 2 years, and one outcome of that work was the International Launch Portal, which is a database that links payloads to potential launchers. Next to Andy, on his left, is Dr. Jim Wertz, who's the president of Microcosm. He has technical and management responsibility for work in Microcosm's main business area, which is space mission engineering, low-cost space launch systems, autonomous navigation and control, satellite orbit attitude systems, space-centric design, and space software development. Under the direction of Jim, Microcosm has become a principal creator of practical solutions to reduce both space mission costs and launch costs. Jim is also the editor and principal author of several of the most widely used spacecraft textbooks. Many of the engineers, whether it be NASA, NRO, Air Force, others, learned under your tutelage and certainly from your textbooks, Jim.
There'll be a quiz after that.
Absolutely. So the order of march will be as we've introduced. Again, Skunk at the end will be the guy who stimulates the conversation. With no further ado, I'll hand it over to Ann.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my 5th or 6th GEOINT conference. I wasn't here for the last 2 years, I believe, but it's good to be back. So I'm going to talk a little bit at first about meteorological satellites. I think what is unique about PlanetIQ on this panel is not only the disruptive technology in the small sat business, but most importantly, and the most difficult part of our business plan is changing the business model for weather forecast agencies around the globe. So Rob, with the next slide. If you, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the U.S. weather infrastructure, but it's in shambles for a whole host of good reasons and some very unfortunate bureaucratic reasons. But this does not tell well for the globe because the U.S., if you add up all of the rest of the world, all of those budgets combined are half of what the U.S. spends on space-based architecture for weather satellites. And the U.S. weather satellites have serious issues. To the extent that the General Accounting Office ranked NOAA's weather satellite program, particularly the JPSS satellite, which is a polar orbiter in an afternoon orbit, as a very high-risk project, and it's actually the second highest risk project in the federal government. NOAA for some time debated whether or not we ran the issue of a satellite weather gap, but NOAA has now reevaluated the data, and there is the real risk that our weather forecast is going to get dramatically worse before it gets better. This at the same time that the Department of Defense has reevaluated and gone through an analysis of alternatives to see what does the Defense Department really need for an all-weather force. And out of that analysis of alternatives, the Defense Department is going to rely on NOAA, on foreign partners. They will fly what they absolutely must, where they have a unique requirement, and if there is a commercial sector there to supply data, they will also turn to the commercial sector. So next slide, Rob. So this is a very, very similar situation to what happened in the imagery world. I'm going to leave that part of the story out of it for a minute. Here are 4 sectors, space-based, big business, that were once a monopsony, a government-controlled monopoly, that are now commercial ventures. If you look at satellite comms in the 1960s, when President Kennedy set up the first quasi-private public satellite comms, that's now a $20 billion a year market, largely provided by the commercial sector. And General Shelton went on record about 2 months ago now saying all of the satellite comms for the DoD or for the Air Force could be supplied by the commercial marketplace. Look at the space shuttle. Who would have thought 8 years ago that we would have commercialized the space shuttle and we would have private companies competing to fly our astronauts into space? Then let's revisit the imagery world. So back in the early 2000s, when orbital and space imaging and the other companies were trying to come out of the ground, I actually worked for NOAA. And I was NOAA's representative to the Civilian Application Committee, to the intelligence community, on all imaging issues. And I'm quite familiar with the long, hard birth, if you will, the long, hard, ugly birth of the commercial imagery world. NRO was not motivated, NGA at that time, NEMO, was not motivated to let the commercial companies come out of the ground, nor was NOAA, that had to supply the imaging license. But it was the exact same situation. The FIA architecture was dramatically over budget and dramatically behind schedule. And the warfighter ran the risk of flying blind. And that became an unacceptable risk to the DoD. And there was born the beginning of the Clear View, Next View, and now Enhanced View contracts. One could say that that commercialization was very bumpy, but I would also draw your attention to the fact that the commercialization of satellite comms took over 50 years. The commercialization of imagery has taken 15 years, and now we're seeing the next generation and the next set of innovation. The commercialization of space transportation took about 7 to 8 years. This is happening faster. Why? Because it makes good sense. Space is not as difficult as it used to be. It's still difficult, it's still risky, but this is an area where the commercial sector, I believe, has a lot to offer government. So PlanetIQ is looking to be the first commercial weather satellite company on the globe. I do have a direct competitor. To me, that's a great sign. It means it's real. And I have a competitor, someone who's looking, a company that's looking to fly a similar business model with a very different type of data, and that company is called GEOINT. Next slide. So let's talk about why this business model needs to be disrupted. It is very difficult. I spent 18 years in government. I love the mission. I enjoyed every day that I was there. I'm very passionate about the mission. But we set up our democracy to move very slowly. Congress, the last 3 or 4 Congresses in the next 5 or 10 are making that democracy move even more slowly. It's exceptionally dysfunctional. It's very difficult to plan programs of this nature with, that take a 3 or 4 year engineering and requirements analysis, and then a 2-year procurement that's inevitably going to be protested, and then wait for a launch because you were unable to put your money down on the launch. Oh, and then 12 years later, you're launching technology that was developed 14 years ago. Technology is moving quickly, particularly in the weather arena. If you think about weather, weather is just a finite element model. that we dramatically undersample right now. And it is a global, social, public good. Every citizen of the globe deserves a great weather forecast. Weather is also a huge business. And the business requirements for weather and climate and the changing climate, regardless of what the reasons for that change are, business is now betting that there is change afoot, and in order to minimize the risk to their revenue, they want to understand more about it. So you have the government with a slow pace of innovation, with an aging fleet of satellites, with very inefficient procurement mechanisms because they were set up to be inefficient. It's not the government employees' fault. Up against a growing commercial demand for data, market-driven information, our ability to innovate quickly. We have yet to launch the first satellite, and we're looking at innovations that are going to go on 13 through 18 already because we're free to do that. And the disruptive economics. So, next slide, Rob. So I wanted to leave you with just a few bits about the technology itself because this is a SmallSat session, and I do want to talk about the technology. This is GPS radio occultation technology, and it's made possible by measuring the rising and setting GPS signals in MEO. We'll be down in LEO. We'll have at first 12 satellites in LEO. They'll catch those signals as they bend through the atmosphere, the GPS signals as they bend through the atmosphere. We can measure that bending angle. If you back down on the ground, you look at the timing on that bending angle, and you can back out temperature, pressure, and water vapor. From about 100 meters to the from the surface back out to the ionosphere. We'll also have a number of solar flare instruments on board. And that will give you a profile. We're looking at 18,000 profiles a day, equally spaced around the globe, from the surface back out to the ionosphere, of the most accurate measurement of temperature, pressure, and water vapor that exists. I heard that wrong. Next slide. And I already talked a little bit about the architecture. The first 12, we will launch 4 in 2016, 8 in early 2017. All will be on orbit. We will have a radical difference in the technologies that we'll be moving the data in real time. We'll go up to an Inmarsat terminal, come back to the ground, post-process the data, and be able to distribute that data anywhere in the globe within 3 minutes of the observation being taken. That in particular is of great interest for ionospheric weather, for solar flares, for radio comms, satellite comms, power grid operators. And it is also of interest when there are nowcasts being done. Think about the Midwest in the middle of tornado season when forecasts are being run very, very quickly. Next slide. That's it.
Thank you, Robbie. Great.
Well, it's great to be here. This is my third GEOINT, first time speaking, and it's quite fitting because my community is a small satellite community. More so than the GEOINT community. And I think that what you're doing in using SmallSats for new business models is actually one of the core things hopefully that we'll get out of today when we get to the panel. So I want to talk about two things today. One is Planet Labs, give a little bit of an overview of who we are and what we're doing. And then next I have one slide on a couple of topics that would be great to dig into at the panel. Next, please, and next. So, Planet Labs, we are a privately funded company. We're a venture capital funded company. Started 3.5 years ago, located in San Francisco, and we are an Earth imaging company. So we design, build, manufacture, and operate small imaging satellites. They're 5 kilograms in a 3U form factor, and we've launched 32 of them since we started the company. We do this in an iterative fashion, so we call it agile aerospace, how we build spacecraft every 2 to 3 months, bringing in new technologies as they come online, as well as redesigning the spacecraft for manufacturability. And next, please. So to back up for a little bit and why I ended up leaving NASA to start this company was the realization of a number of different converging trends. It's getting cheaper to build spacecraft. It's getting cheaper to build spacecraft because of billions of dollars that have been invested in other commercial industries, such as in consumer electronics. Then the supply chains that actually make that possible in the manufacturing of consumer electronics. Then the second technology that has made this possible is the proliferation of data and the storage and compute and the commoditization of storage and compute for that. And so when you see these technologies, these hard technologies, it decreases the barrier of actually doing something interesting in space. The next is more frequent access to space, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that, but the last dozen years, being able to ride up to space as secondary payloads. And if you're a little bit more agile about where you go, then you can actually get into space more frequently. And the last is a bit of my background. I actually grew up learning how to build spacecraft as small satellites in university, and all the way through NASA and now. So this is actually the way in which my team, we know how to build spacecraft. And at NASA, I don't know how many of you guys have worked at NASA, but it's actually a fairly meritocratic organization where you pitch a new mission. So we got really used to kind of pitching missions and buying down risk and doing that stuff. And it turns out that was actually very similar to what you need to do if you're pitching venture capitalists to get money. Next. So we left NASA and we started in our garage, as any good Silicon Valley startup does. You can see in the lower right-hand corner there, that's build one. That is the first build of our spacecraft. We knew that we could build spaceships differently, and we thought through dozens of different new missions that we can do from science to exploration to commercial, and realized the largest lever that we could have for the sector that we cared about, which is the aerospace sector, was to do it commercially. And also realizing that a commercial space venture isn't necessarily just the hardware or the satellite or the launch vehicle, but it's actually in the information, so that you have orders of magnitude more people that you can sell your product to. We looked at the commercial space sector, and and it's telecom, and as it exists today, telecom and imaging. And if you can redesign the space sector the space segment in order to disaggregate your satellite into multiple different nodes, we decided to do an imaging mission. And any imaging mission is a point design of 5 things. It's your spatial resolution, your image quality, your coverage, so it's swath width, your currency, how frequently you can update that, and your overall cost. So we did a capabilities-based approach and a 3U form factor to differentiate on the latter 3 things, which is coverage, cadence, and cost. Next, please. So we're a completely vertically integrated company. We have 0 aerospace suppliers in our supply chain. We are on our 10th iteration of the spacecraft. We're probably on our 4th iteration of the ground segment. We have about 8 ground stations throughout the planet. We have launched 4 satellites into space last year as tech demos, just purely to test operations and mission control, as well as the satellite itself. And then in January this year, we launched 28 satellites. And they went up to the International Space Station on a commercial cargo mission. And then they were deployed via the Japanese airlock at the end of February, 2 at a time, from the International Space Station. So 28 satellites are now in a 52-kilometer orbit, and or 52-degree inclined orbit, and we are currently checking them out right now as we're going through. And I have a few pictures coming up. But before I get to that, I guess what I want to also talk about is more of our commercial platform that we're building. And so this is, all the space stuff is inside the company. It's an internal cost center for us. And what we're building is a commercial product. So we first went to agriculture companies and mapping companies and value-added service providers to find out what they actually wanted. And they really wanted imagery on demand. They wanted to be able to see it before they buy it, and they wanted to be able to do some compute against it. And so this is an always-on constellation. We're doing a monitoring capability rather than a tasking capability. And you can actually see the data before you go ahead and do analysis or download it or buy it. So this is a persistent global monitoring capability. And we have our work cut out for us this year because we have a few more constellations going up this year. We aim to have a commercially available product with general availability early next year, where people can swipe their credit card and get access to these data. I should state that we thought about the personal privacy stuff and the national security attributes of this very carefully and chose a spatial resolution of 3 to 5 meters per pixel so that we can, A, get at that differentiating thing, which is global coverage updated every day, and then B, not get into too much tactical national security issues, and we get people used to consuming imagery on demand like this. And then as the corpus of data grows, then that's when you can do some interesting analysis on the historic archive, where you can see some precursor events before an event actually occurs. You can get to alerting stuff and actually more predictive activities. Next. So this is flock 1. We call our satellites doves, and the first flock of 28 satellites. This is in our lab in San Francisco in December. Next. Here you can actually see 2 of them being ejected from the International Space Station. This is actually really cool because astronauts were taking pictures of your satellites as they're being ejected, which typically does not happen. Next. And a lot of great imagery. Next. Next. This is a week and a half ago. We have a 5-meter dish we just erected down in South Island, New Zealand. Next. Here you can see Mike looking at flock 1. The spacecraft were ejected about 3 weeks apart. So you can see how there's a clump on the north part and a clump on the southern part. We use differential drag because we don't have active propulsion on board in order to do that, but over the next 6 weeks they'll be evenly distributed throughout that orbit. Here's what a mission control looks like. It looks more like what a sysadmin would see if they're taking a look at their data center. We really just want to flag the operator to see what's operating well, what's not operating well. Here's first flight of one of the spacecraft. This is of Davis. This is about 4 meters per pixel. And then so that's it on Planet Labs, but I wanted to also highlight a couple of things that would be great to speak about in this panel today. One is small satellites have the ability for us to rethink the space sector a little bit and get away from the vicious cycle of risk aversion within the aerospace community. And that's due to launch on one side and the space segment on the other side. And with secondary payloads, you can kind of suspend disbelief around the launch side and begin to innovate on the satellite. And there are very good reasons why we're kind of stuck in this world, and it's because when we have 70 global launches for $300 billion of economic activity, you want to make sure that your billion-dollar asset is really going to work. And if that's really going to work, then the rocket definitely have to work. Then you end up with the fixed cost in order to get access to space, and then not frequent access to space, and you get into this vicious cycle. So small spacecraft can allow for us to test out new cost points and risk posture toward what we do in space in order to actually accelerate our space capability. And then when you disaggregate the space segment into multiple nodes or multiple sensors, then you can come up with new missions that otherwise weren't possible before. If you think about space security aspects as well, you can actually disaggregate the risk into multiple nodes. And then as launch becomes more responsive and spacecraft become more responsive, then you can also replace systems on a temporary basis. Also, as a bit of a provocative thing too, what would happen if the space segment actually does become commoditized, and that the business is really about information business? And we see how much industry has actually accelerated over the last dozen or so years, because there actually is a lot of true market forces and investment going into that. So what would happen with our sector if in fact this does really take off and becomes truly commercial? But then the last point is that we have PlanetIQ and Planet Labs up here, Microcosm as well. We're 3 of dozens of new startups that are doing things in space. This really truly is a bit of a space renaissance. Where private investment is coming in and trying to come up with new commercial models of how things are done. But the question is also for the government folks in the room is, what is the role of the U.S. government in this? We truly are the best place for the access to get capital, risk capital, the United States for sure, in addition to talent. But there are more non-US companies that are doing new things in space than US companies doing things in space. And so what really truly should be the role of the United States government to do that? Small satellites, I think it does make a lot of sense for that to happen here. Launch is even more difficult to happen here because of regulations and range costs and so forth. So some of the nanosat launch capabilities that are coming online may actually be more competitive overseas. But with that, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Robbie. That was a great introduction. There's a little bit of an overlap that I'll talk about a little bit with the Planet Labs and what Aerospace is. But this is my first GEOINT, so I appreciate it. I so far am enjoying all of the aspects of the discussions and where it's heading. Because I think there's a whole new world ahead of us that Robbie just introduced that I think is going to make it even more dynamic. Let's see, can we go to the previous chart or the next chart? I think it's there. So what I really wanted to talk about was, Aerospace is a non-profit California corporation that runs for the government a federally funded research and development center. So unlike the other participants, I do not represent a commercial entity. But what you see up here is just a brief history of Aerospace's involvement in the miniaturization of satellites for many decades. It actually started in the late 80s, early 90s with some very visionary thinking folks that just wanted to see how small we could miniaturize every subsystem on these complex satellites and prove that you could do it. And back then, there was a lot of disbelief. Some of the same debates you hear today were even fiercer back then. So the very first one you see that was in 1999 it was launched on a Stanford program. It was called a Pico satellite. We were actually demonstrating MEMS capabilities just to see if you could have a MEMS device operate in space. And also we had to have them tethered so you could actually see it. They were so small, how could we determine where it was? Well, it turns out Robbie was in school and he worked on that back then in the early 90s. After that, Aerospace made them a little bit larger, and they were still considered our picosat class. They were about 5 inches square. But through some conversations with a professor at Stanford, Bob Twiggs, he saw it as an educational vehicle for his master's program. So he ended up creating the CubeSat program, which is a 10 centimeter square box. I asked him once why he picked 10 centimeters instead of our 5 inches, and he said that's because he brought in a box from home to make his case, and that happened to be the size of a Beanie Baby box. So that was the origins of the CubeSat. So over the years, we've been continuing to evolve and prove that you can miniaturize every component necessary to fly a capable satellite in very small packages. And a lot of the arguments about physics and things that just cannot be done because of optics cycles and whatnot, they continue to be challenged. And early on, Aerospace just reached a conclusion that at the very least just doing tech demos was important to move this industry forward. So this timeline is really just showing us doing things every iteration, just improving them and getting better and better. And we even have a derivative product, that round looking thing is called a re-entry breakup recorder. It is actually a cousin of our picosat program to measure the environment as things try to break up as they re-enter into the atmosphere. That's actually been licensed and commercialized. Rob, can you try to get the video going? Sure. So for me to kind of wrap up here, one of the things that Aerospace has always been a believer in is actually that at some point in the future there would be a Planet Labs. So I feel good about being able to sit next to someone that proved us right way back then. But one of the other things that we continue to do is try to improve the performance of these satellites so that they could actually get recognized and respected as doing serious missions, not just toys, not just education, but they really could augment and supplement the bigger vehicles. And I think with all the budget constraints and sequestration, that's become more and more pertinent. And with all the different launch vehicles and the rideshare opportunities, that's become more pertinent. So what this is loading up is just a little demo of a flight over Australia. And what we were
Launch on demand within 8 hours of an unanticipated demand, and launches through 99.9% of winds aloft. It's an all-composite vehicle, and so it is remarkably stiff. It's scalable to larger ones as well. We think that on the whole, again, this has also been independently verified in terms of both the technology and the cost by an independent panel that was funded by the Air Force to do it. But again, there are obviously a variety of small launch vehicle programs out there. We think this one at least has some valuable characteristics associated with it that gets us to where we can in fact put small satellites into orbit essentially on demand. And if they're going to become operational rather than experimental, that's the sort of thing that we need to have happen. So that's a quick summary of microcosm technologies and what we think is the case for small satellites. This just, by the way, summarizes what we think the problem is that we're trying to resolve. That's what we call the space spiral over there in the lower right-hand corner. The space spiral suggests that if you have higher costs, what happens? That brings in longer schedules, fewer missions, a demand for higher reliability, which is usually parts reliability actually. That of course drives you to higher cost, and that drives you to fewer missions, and so on and so forth, and that's where we're going. And it's clear that's the process that we have to somehow turn around. And we think that small satellites can help turn that around, can help reverse that space spiral to get us into something that makes a great deal more sense, where we can have more missions, lower cost, less risk, but less mission risk, and therefore more accommodating of individual spacecraft failures that might occur. As has been pointed out earlier, we don't want missions that last 15 years. If it takes 12 or 14 years to build it, as you were pointing out, you have it last for 15 years on orbit. Now when you're done, you've got 30-year-old technology. If that was what our cell phone had, would still have a cord on it. You know, it doesn't make any sense. We don't want that kind of technology. We want to be able to update it very frequently in order to make this occur in a way that makes sense so we can introduce new technology. And that's what we can do with a SmallSat model. That's it.
We have about half an hour for discussion now, and we really want to be a discussion. As we started this morning with the opening over in the ballroom, we talked about stirring the pot. We want to do that. I want to open it up for the audience to ask questions. I'm telling you, I'm thinking about the fact I'm former Army intel, and I remember reading in the history of Army that there was a time when somebody had an idea about rifled barrels, and most of the leadership of the Army back then, at that moment in time, said, why would we need that? And fought it. You know, as we talk about the innovator's dilemma as you move through time, here we are now. You can see that this is not just junk sats, junk science. It's real. So I'd like to now find anybody in the audience have a question you want to start with, and then Skunk, you know, you'll be stirring the pot as well. Anybody? Why don't you get people just
You think about people like Billy Mitchell and people like that. Those people gave up their personal lives and their reputations to actually get something done. So the rifle barrels, the aircraft, etc. But one thing and I'll address this to everybody. And by the way, the audience, feel free to jump in. Fisticuffs are not allowed, but everybody else can do whatever they want. And if you want to discuss amongst yourself, feel free. The commercial sector is driven a lot of different things, and I'm a big fan of it. If I were a reinsurance company and I was starting to think about what would happen after a solar event when much of the world goes back to the 18th century, I'd start to think real hard about how I could maintain my business model and how I could operate while most of the world is still trading in rabbit skins. Could I stay viable? Could my banking, insurance, my ability to support not only the civilian sector, but the military sector? How would I do that? And it sounds like the ability to reconstitute on a civilian level, and certainly on a military level, sounds like a viable option. How would, and I've asked people on the panel and also in the audience, how would you go about convincing the business community that this is in their best interest?
Yeah, so I don't think you have to convince the business community. We've gotten a very warm reception with Munich Re and the other very large reinsurance companies around the globe, far more so than I thought we would. Our greatest challenge is in convincing the governments of the world, because all meteorological satellites are owned by the governments of the world. And there's no desire for the model to change, really institutionally, in the behavior, much like the NRO 13 years ago. But look at the benefits that it's brought. The warfighter, which is the most important person in the chain, right? And I think you'll see that same benefit when it comes to improving the forecast. But, you know, it's wonderful actually to see that businesses have to be resilient. And they don't really care where the data comes from. Sure, they'd rather get it for free, but they no longer believe the governments of the world are going to keep pace with innovation, and they cannot risk their business. So back to that, you know, seesaw, that teeter-totter I showed, the risk to them of not being prepared for risk, which they see coming, is too great to rely on government. And that's going to drive the model.
So Skunk, I think was part of your question about a business that's currently involved in building the large sats, and how do you move a company like that to think that on the horizon changes in the wind. You know, it's going to happen. How do we move more quickly? What's the business incentive for a large company that builds the large birds to be able to move more towards smaller disaggregated? Is that what you were referring to?
Well, and that's part of it. And I always use the example, having many years in the rock and roll business. It used to cost a lot to make records. Anybody remember a song called My Sharona? You know how much it cost to make that whole album? $11,000. That means that somebody, instead of spending a whole lot of money, said, you know, where's the art part of this? And I think the art part of this comes from brilliant engineers, people who are driven to do things with less money and smaller budgets. So why would a large company then want to, how would you incentivize a large company to say, okay, instead of charging $100 bazillion for a satellite, what is the driver to get a large company to do that? How would you convince them?
Well, I've got a couple of comments on that. So I think it's been mentioned a number of times that it's really about the data and the availability of the data to the end user. And one of my favorite stories is, and I have a little bit too much gray in my beard to have to keep saying this, but GPS is a good example. GPS was debated for many years. I don't know if many people knew this, but it was canceled almost every year for like a 5 or 8 year period because it was just too phenomenal to think you'd have these, you know, precision nuclear clocks floating around the Earth telling you where you were. Nowadays, people don't even know that they can live without GPS. You can't walk around with a mobile device. There are kids that don't understand why you have to spend money to build a GPS satellite because they have it on their phone. So it's actually gotten to a point where it has been so commoditized that people don't understand the full implications. But those are very complex, expensive systems, and they have some real hard science that went into them. As far as moving those large corporations to be more motivated for small satellites, Rob and I were talking about this earlier, I think the realities of the budget constraints are palatable. They've got to recognize that. I think there's always going to be a real need and an appropriate intent for very large, complex sensors and systems. But if you had to do all of your 5 different types of missions you might want to do, I think rethinking it now, you can't afford to do them the expensive way anymore. So if 2 of them just needed to be a big bird satellite, you might want to figure out alternatives for the other missions. So if you could start offloading it to PlanetIQ and Planet Labs, I'd take a serious look at that. And then you can go make the case. Now I need my multi-billion-dollar program because we can't do that with those other systems. The other thing I was going to say was that Rob pointed out that when you go through your architecture analysis for these systems, you look at how much coverage you have of the Earth, the swath width, the power requirements, what altitude you're at. There's all kinds of things you look at. Now that we're getting less expensive capabilities, more capable, smaller packages, and launch opportunities that are coming into the fold, that architectural analysis now has shifted because you can now say, look, I can actually launch 100 small satellites instead of 8 larger ones, and I get this for that money instead of this, but now I can do that because very few satellite companies ever survive trying to do the Iridium size constellation. So I think the economics have moved to do that, and now if you launch 100, you might be close to the similar price tag to sustain a large, bureaucracy, because you're launching more. But now you're looking at it from a system perspective. You see the entire impact of that system and what that system is doing for giving you persistence. Persistence seems to be something that is talked about a lot.
Would you think the reinsurance companies, since the reinsurance companies run the world, I learned that a long time ago, would a reinsurance company be interested in saying, well, company X, if you're willing to invest in some small satellites as backups for, say, a coronal event or something like that, we're going to lower your insurance premiums. Do things like that work in the business community?
There's another element that's required in all of this. If I'm going to have reconstitution of assets for any reason at all, one of the things that I need is the ability to respond quickly, of course. And that in turn, I think, implies a different business model. Today, on the whole, you build something, and as soon as you build it, you launch it, because it's a really expensive asset. When you drive down the cost of the asset, both the launch vehicle and the spacecraft, then you can do build, inventory, and launch on demand. And of course, that's exactly what you do with everything else in the world, with airplanes or cars or trains. Who cares how long it takes to build a car or an airplane? All I care is one available on the lot when I want to go buy one at some level. It's the same sort of thing you'd like to have here. That's what you need for reconstitution of assets, but it's also what you need for a different class of mission as well. And that is to say, emergency response kinds of things. You're trying to find an airplane that got lost in the South Indian Ocean. Okay? You want to be able to launch an asset that can in fact cover that area much more frequently, much more easily. Russia decides to invade a neighboring country somewhere. Okay? Not that that would ever occur, of course. But, that's the sort of thing you would like to be able to launch assets in response to. It is technically remarkably doable. Recall 1982, the Falklands War. The Soviet Union launched 29 payloads in 69 days in direct response to the Falklands War. The United States cannot do that today, and that's not a good thing. We want to be able to provide that kind of capability.
Let me tie several of your comments together with a question for the audience, maybe from the audience. How many people in the room, your focus is either defense, intelligence, or homeland security? Show of hands. So the vast majority of the people in the room are focused on those. So you start with the end user need, right? And then times threat, times budget, and so on. From an end user need, and if we look at the threat environment, it seems to me like we've seen a lot in the last couple of years. In fact, from the president and his national space policy in 2010, where he said we have to be able to operate through a contested environment, and he meant a near peer who likely can use cyber and kinetic against us. We saw the commander of SpaceCom just 6 weeks ago at George Washington University, General Shelton, talk about the challenge in that regard. From a national perspective, it seems like there's been a fairly clear statement that we need to be able to supplement and complement national technical means in extremis from a national standpoint, cyber or kinetic. From a tactical standpoint, it seems like we've heard from the tactical users over and over and over for years that while national technical means are enormously powerful and capable, when the stuff's hitting the fan, they need something that's going to be optimized for their need. They must think this way, otherwise you wouldn't have the commander of SMDC down in Huntsville spending energy and money and resources to move forward on tactical satellites that are aimed at Army needs. So you've got an end user, a national end, you've got a tactical end, you've got Army coming off the green ramp at Fort Bragg, may have to do a forced entry, and there may not be ISR search forward like there has been for 12, 13 years now. You've got so my question is, you've got an end user need, you've got threat, and you've got the budget problem. So what's the holdup, gang? You're on the panel and in the audience. I mean, what do you see the boulder that needs to be moved, and how do you move it?
I would argue at least that there are many people, obviously the government is not a monolithic whole in any sense at all. There are a large number of people that are convinced of the value and of the need for small satellites, quick response, and so on and so forth. But equally clearly, I think, if you look at the character of the government collectively, the way the government speaks is by spending money. And look at the amount of money the government is putting into dumping into small satellites to building them today. And that pile is not very deep. It is remarkably shallow. That is to say, the decision-making process thus far has not gotten to the point where it's recognized either the capability or the value of doing that. There is still a very strong commitment to traditional large satellites, I believe, within the decision-making authority in the government.
And why do you think that's the case still today?
Oh, I agree 100%. I mean, I think there is an aversion to risk in the government workforce. I think inertia is a really big problem. And I do think the business model is changing. And I think some of the institutions and corporations who have been building pristine billion-dollar systems are also very concerned about the changing business model. So I have spent, in the last 10 months, I've had probably 170 meetings on the Hill. I've gotten thousands of dollars in parking tickets. And I have gotten a great reception on both sides of the Hill. Gratefully, you know, weather is a nonpartisan issue, and this country faces a big problem. But I also know that some of those very large companies that are very vested in those $3 and $4 billion systems have been in there the day before me countering my argument. So, you know, and this is beautiful, you know, it's industry, we're at work here, right? It's capitalism. We get to disagree, hopefully in a very factual way. But I think this changing business model is not only threatening to government employees for all the issues that I think we all know, but I think it's also threatening to another part of industry. So it would be disingenuous of us to sit up here and say it worked, right?
So questions from the audience. Here we go, sir, over here.
So when talking about changing this dynamic, you're requesting that the government workforce or anybody representing that to change the way that they think. But what I haven't seen yet in learning about SmallSats is, so what's the life expectancy? How do you properly plan a program with multiple sensors instead of, you know, large sensors? But how do you plan that from a logistical piece? What's your life cycle on your SmallSat? How do you plan that, and how do you educate the workforce that way?
So I think our businesses are a little bit different that way. So our businesses are sourced from aerospace companies, and our lifespan design is 7 years. Okay. And our build is about $8.5 million per satellite. And I think that's important in particular. I think, you know, the businesses we're in are in different stages, imagery versus atmospheric science. And all of my customers are scientists. They're atmospheric scientists, and they want precision. And so we have to hit a different hurdle. We also have to have fuel on board to make sure that we're in the right orbits with all 12. And at $8.5 million, we have to have a design life that's greater than 2 years.
Yeah, I was going to point out that PlanetIQ is more of the traditional architecture, and when you have a constellation of that size, I think they still call it gap analysis, don't they? So when one of those systems doesn't arrive on orbit or it fails prematurely, you have a gap, and those gaps, we become very used to this data, and so there's this term resiliency we've been talking about. We need much more resilient systems because we're too accustomed to this information being available, and it becomes really painful when you actually have one of these systems go out, and now you have these periods of time when you don't see it. That's not only, you know, critically important for the warfighter, but these systems now have to be resilient because they're embedded in our daily lives, and they will have tremendous economic impact on the nation if we start having major economic hits that are going to affect our ability to move forward. To your point, talking about, you know, these systems, you have to think about it a little bit differently, and I think we have to go prove it. I think that's the problem. There's a lot of really smart people that have some very good arguments against this. So you can argue all day. So you have to go out and actually just do it and prove that these things actually have a foothold. So I like the whole Silicon Valley. You know, we're going to try, and maybe it won't work perfect, but we're going to try it again. But looking at that system's architecture, you have to look at the whole system and the entire long-term life cycle of what that business plan is, because now you have this replenishment capability that's dialed in. It's not the satellite lasting longer. I don't know what the business plan is, but they could have a 12-year business plan, and they've accounted for all of this. What I like about it is you also are going to be taking advantage of critical advancements in new technologies that now can be embedded and put up there within a 3 or 4 or 5 year period, not waiting 10 or 12 or 18. And then you've also got this resilience factor that the data, you know, if one of them's not working quite right, you've got more options, and you're going to have a better chance of having that data available to at least a portion of your user community.
So Andy, what you're saying is that people wouldn't be okay with keeping the same model of iPhone for 7, 8, 9 years? So the replenishment rate, right, the refresh technology, there's actually a downside to having a program last those years, lengths of years, right?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, and combining it with the one before about how to change really the procurement cycle of government in order to take on something that has more risk, but potentially greater reward if it comes up, it's a matter of, from our perspective, who's our first customers. And actually we have traction in commercial industry, where these type of data would be a differentiator for some of our customers, so they're willing to go to market with us, knowing that this makes sense. The resilience of the organization and the data continuity across different generations of sensors. And so we don't have a contract with the U.S. government. Right? It's in agriculture and in mapping and in value-added service providers that see that this actually could happen. And with these satellites that come online, and then about a quarter later with other satellites that come online, then we actually prove the data continuity across it and get to imagery on demand to a point where then we have a product that is resilient and robust, and some of the risk has been taken out of it by the commercial sector.
Darryl, I saw your hand in the back.
Can I respond to this one once more? I would argue that you have, in fact, much lower risk with the set of small satellites. If you, at this point, have a relatively small number of large satellites, if those large satellites, 1 or 2 of them, in fact, disappear for any reason, they run into a piece of debris you can't see, it's going to be many years before those are replaced, certainly long beyond any immediate need you have for them. On the other hand, with a set of small satellites, you may well have, for example, take the Iridium constellation, have spares on orbit, ready to go. So in fact, if you lose a satellite, you don't lose performance. Okay, you still have the system performance there available. And in fact, you have replacement satellites available so that you can launch them essentially immediately. You do need to have build inventory and launch on demand. Those are 2 key characteristics. You can do that when you drive down the cost. The cost of a satellite at a few $1 million or so, or a launch vehicle at a few $1 million, sitting in your warehouse is around $10,000 a month. You got to borrow the money from somebody to go do that after all. So it's going to cost you about that amount of money, and that's not a dramatic cost in terms of having that asset available to you. So in fact, you can drive the risk down substantially, where by risk you mean is the data available to the end user. It's not whether or not that particular satellite is alive, because any satellite can get killed for a number of reasons. It's whether or not I can get the data to the end user when they need it.
Darryl?
Okay, so my question is, really speaks more to the FUD factor of SmallSat. And when we talk about fear, uncertainty, and doubt, some of it's planted by established folks in the space business. And I'm curious, in terms of both a CalVal or a VMV's programs that you all have, how do you plan on dealing with some of those it's not good enough kind of fear, uncertainty, doubt ideas as you roll out your respective data sets to the global community?
Yeah, this is part of the reason why we're going to the government as a second customer. It's the nicest way to say it. And it's because we can iterate on the image quality, right? And if you think about the end-to-end complicated systems architecture that we have of ground stations everywhere, mission control, dozens of spacecraft, and all this imagery, and automated image processing, and exposing that to the web, and then keep launching these things, and getting your, having cash flow working, and getting your licenses and so forth, it's actually pretty complex, and we have that working now. So now we can make it more resilient, more robust, more scalable, and we can iterate based on what the commercial market wants, and the government should become part of that commercial market. And so if they're willing to pay for a certain type of image quality, then that's actually a business decision for us in order to iterate our spacecraft design in order to meet that image quality.
So in our case, we are partially owned by a company called Broadreach Engineering, which has now been purchased by Moog. Broadreach Engineering has built 20 GPS radio occultation sensors on orbit, more than anyone else ever has, and they are considered the gold standard of GPS radio occultation sensors. So that's a little bit of buying down those who are skeptical. And then the other part is there is a research constellation that's operating today by the Taiwanese government called COSMIC. That data is processed by the University Consortium for Atmospheric Research, which is located in Boulder, Colorado. And we are in negotiations with UCAR to also develop our ground processing systems. And that's the right thing to do, I think, for the user community as well, because the Taiwanese system will continue to operate, and making sure there's calibration between the Taiwanese data and PlanetIQ data is fundamental. So that's how we've dealt with that.
So we have time for one more question. I think there, yes, sir. Right there with your hand up, yes, sir. You.
All right. So I think the panel or the audience asked the question is, there's a risk. Why nobody actually take the risk and expand the business? I think there are two factors here. One is the technology demonstration. To what standard, to what extent the technology is proved reliable, people is willing to give the instrument a lot. For example, if I have $1 million instrument, I may not be able to find insurance say, okay, if the satellite fall, it's my pay the check. Okay, I will bring the instrument. But if the logic can say we launched 100, we have 95% reliability, that's a confidence. So my first, I think, is what level technology prove it's to a certain extent, and we can use the small satellite. Second is a business model. As Anne pointed out, is there's critical data that matters DOD was really used. For example, she pointed out there is a 53 months data gap, right? And at that time, CNN will sign her satellite to provide a weather. Everybody will use. The insurance company will sign and say, okay, based on the data, how we actually will price the insurance. So I think if we can consider these two factors, technology demonstration in the business model, there's possibility we can actually expand this business. Right now, it's kind of unclear to say, yes, it's a low cost to build and launch satellite. How about the server's cost, right? So that should be considered one package.
Yeah, so I think I spoke to the data with the sensors we're flying have been proven. They're gold standard. Every forecast agency around the globe and private forecast agencies around the globe want a lot more of it. But so I may not have fully understood your question, but here's a big difference in the business model. We are not asking for a single penny from any government around the globe in advance of launch. So if those things blow up, that's PlanetIQ's problem, right? There is $64 million in our business model for 2 launches, one as a secondary ride, 2 as the second one as a primary ride, and the insurance. That whole event lasts 30 minutes, and it's $64 million, which is ludicrous, right? But there is no risk to any government around the world, because we're not asking for any upfront money, which is very dissimilar from the imagery world and the clear view, next view, and enhanced view contract. That is a radical difference. And that's something that's actually working to our favor in these budget times, because this gap is going to show up. probably after this administration, but this administration has to plan for this gap now, right? And we're not asking them to put money on the table, we're asking them to sign a non-binding letter of intent. And then I think the other issue is the requirements of the future are not gonna come from, government is not going to have the strongest requirements of the future, the private sector is. You look at how much is at risk with weather every day, and if there were a solar flare, $3.5 trillion in economic damage to the United States of America alone. And there is no risk mitigation strategy in place. So Duke Power is interested, SCE&G is interested, Chesapeake Bay is interested, a lot of big name companies, John Deere, on and on and on. That is too much risk. The requirements of the future for weather are going to be driven by the private sector, not by the governments around the globe. But the governments will benefit. And most importantly, the forecast. Every citizen on the globe deserves a great forecast. So the model is changing, at least in the weather world.
And analogous to that, as we close out, is who would have thought that 800 million people a day would be using something called Google Earth? Those are, when we're not talking about intelligence analysts, 800 million people around the world using that kind of a head tool, if you will. Panelists, thank you for your insights today. We really appreciate it. I'm sure all of the panelists are willing to meet later on and talk to you over the course of the next few days. Thanks.